Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Gender Colab webinar. Today, we're going to talk about driving gender-responsive policies to improve migrant women financial inclusion outcome. Before we start the session, I just want to share a few logistic notes with everyone. So this webinar will last for about 1 hour and 15 minutes. It is being recorded and we'll share it with all the participants. And there's a Q&A section where you can ask your question to panelists. So please mention their name so that they can answer directly or during the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. That's it for me. I pass the floor to my dear colleague, Uloma Hogba, who's gonna be your host today and drive the discussion.
Thank you, Louis. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on data for decision-making, driving gender-responsive policies to improve migrant women's financial inclusion outcomes. My name is Uloma Ogba, and I'm the lead gender specialist for the Migration and Remittances program at UNCDF, and I'll be moderating today's session. Next slide, please. So this webinar is part of UNCDF's Gender Collaborative for Remittances, or Gender Colab for short. The Gender Colab is a platform for engagement between key decision makers and practitioners in the remittances sector. It facilitates the sharing of insights from gender mainstreaming efforts and discusses emerging trends in evidence-based and gender-smart remittance policymaking and innovation. It cuts across policy, innovation, and research, with collaborations between research partners, industry leaders, and field practitioners. The Gender Colab is open to all who are interested in contributing to its mission and goals. The next and final session for this year will be hosted in December, so please be on the lookout for more information in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. So in today's gathering, we will explore how gender disaggregated data is crucial to the decision-making processes that support migrant women's financial inclusion outcomes. Our discussion will delve into aspects such as data collection and sharing, measurement methodologies, and perhaps most importantly, the policy impact. Financial inclusion is a fundamental right, empowering individuals and communities alike. However, understanding its nuances through a gender lens is vital. The unique needs, knowledge, and capabilities of migrant women should be reflected and safeguarded in policies in a way that promotes their financial inclusion. Recognition of the importance and impact of timely and relevant data to inform policymaking processes has grown in recent years, as demonstrated by several new initiatives. For example, in 2019, Data2X, a gender data alliance, established the Gender Data Network, which brings together gender data experts from national statistical systems in 15 countries to share solutions and overcome barriers for producing and using high-quality gender data. Data2X also hosts the Women's Financial Inclusion Data Partnership to help identify data gaps and market opportunities. Similarly, the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, AFI Global, who we will hear from today, established the AFI Data Portal in 2016, an online portal on financial inclusion policies, regulations, and outcomes using data from over 60 countries. Next slide, please. So here at UNCDF, we conducted a multi-year demand-side research initiative to address data and knowledge gaps because they hinder the ability of remittance service providers, policymakers, and regulators to reach the last mile. The research comprises multiple sources of data and validation stages. So far, we harmonized analysis for 10 remittance service providers, analyzing a total of 80 million transaction records for 8 million customers, over 3,000 surveys, 120 customer interviews, and a range of publicly available data. But we did not stop only at surveys and data collection. The insights from these surveys are further validated by our remittance service partners, and you can find a collection of insight articles on our website, which are useful for service providers, policymakers, and regulators alike. Next slide, please. So allow me to share some of the policy recommendations informed by the insights from the study. One, promote financial inclusion of migrants and remittances with a focus on women in financial inclusion strategies. So the research underscores the gender disparities in digital remittance adoption, with women often lagging behind. And to bridge this digital divide, policymakers should set ambitious targets for women's access in financial inclusion strategies. Recognizing the role of remittances in economic development, policymakers can prioritize gender inclusivity. Additionally, economies sending remittances must explicitly consider migrants' unique needs in their financial inclusion plans. Second, leverage timely and relevant sex-disaggregated remittance data to drive decision-making. Women often resort to costly cash-based remittance channels due to the greater obstacles they face in adopting digital options. To address this, we need comprehensive data collection on remittance transactions with a focus on gender-specific insights. This data empowers central banks and regulators to make well-informed decisions that target and mitigate barriers faced by women. Third, develop gender-responsive frameworks to guide remittance policymaking. Enabling digital remittance services requires gender-responsive policies and supervision frameworks. Collaboration with underserved populations, particularly women, is essential. Their perspectives and needs should be incorporated into policy design, ensuring frameworks conducive to women's empowerment. This includes focusing on informal remittance and cash channel usage by migrant women and looking to formalize these remittance flows. And lastly, strengthen consumer protection and financial education for migrants and their families. Regulatory authorities should play an active role in overseeing market conduct and resolving customer complaints. Clear guidelines for complaint resolution and provider accountability build user confidence. Transparency and disclosure requirements for digital remittance apps are crucial to inform users about costs. Also, digital financial literacy and capabilities should be enhanced, especially for women migrants. Collaborative efforts can establish networks to provide relevant training and build financial capability of this group. Next slide, please. So today we're privileged to have gathered experts and thought leaders from around the globe to share their insights and expertise on this critical subject matter. Throughout this webinar, we will navigate the complex terrain of financial inclusion and remittance data as a foundation for policy development and wider decision-making. We will emphasize gender disaggregated data's importance and innovative measurement methods to address existing gaps, leading to more targeted solutions. Our panelists will showcase the tangible impact of data and policies, illuminating pathways to a more inclusive financial landscape. I encourage you to notice the common themes and nuances in the presentations. Let's pinpoint areas for decision-making and operational improvements within our organizations, collectively working to drive meaningful change. With that, I'm delighted to present our speakers, and following their presentations, we'll proceed with the Q&A session. Our first speaker today will be Michael Stewart Evans. Michael is a policy specialist at UN Women. He joined the organization in 2016, and his work focuses on the intersection of gender and migration policy. Prior to joining the UN, Michael obtained a master's degree in public policy and human development with a specialization in migration studies. His research took him to Nicaragua, where he focused on the impact of women's migration on the men left behind. Welcome, Michael. Our second speaker today is Miriam Jamila Zahari. Miriam is a policy specialist at AFI. She oversees AFI's workstream on financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons, where she works with central banks and ministries of finance on their policies and strategies to financially include stateless persons, refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons. She also oversees AFI's workstream on inclusive financial integrity. Welcome, Miriam. Our third speaker is Daniel Escher. Daniel leads customer research at Remitly, a company whose mission is to provide the most trusted financial services on the planet to migrants and their families. His PhD is in sociology, and he lives in Seattle. And lastly, during the Q&A session, we'll be joined by Dr. Robin Gravestein. Robin leads the system and research team on digital finance and inclusive economies at UNCDF, focusing on the global effort around migration and remittances. He has over 17 years of experience in development finance, managing social performance assessment and monitoring systems at Oiko Credit, and providing technical support and impact evaluation to financial service providers in Central Asia while at the ILO. Robin holds a doctorate in social and policy sciences from the University of Bath and 2 master's degrees in international development studies and economics from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Welcome, Robin. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the floor to Michael, our first speaker. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Aloma. I hope you can hear me well. Great, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'd first like to thank UNCDF for inviting UN Women to participate today in this fascinating webinar. And we're so thrilled that UNCDF is really taking a leading role in the area of gender and remittances. It's really filling an invaluable gap. And I'm looking forward today to be providing some insights in UN Women's work in this area. Next slide, please. So I just want to provide a brief overview of what I plan to discuss this morning. So I'd like to start with a bit of an overview of the context. So where we are when we're thinking about migrant women and remittances. I will then provide an example of some analysis that UN Women carried out in this area a couple of years ago, followed by a broader look into sex-disaggregated data and gender statistics in the context of migration and some of the challenges that that poses, specifically in the context of remittance data. And finally, I'll end with some recommendations and also an example from UN Women's current migration program. Next slide, please. So I'd first like to kick off by providing a brief overview of the context and also what we're talking about when we use the term migrant women. First and foremost, it's important to recognize the diversity of women on the move. Whether that relates to their migration status, their employment status, or of course, other characteristics. It's important here to also acknowledge the specific issues related to gender diverse migrants, who are also deeply impacted by gender-based discrimination, but are often almost entirely invisible from policy discussions. However, I want to underline that my presentation today will be specifically focusing on the experiences of migrant women. However, I do want to acknowledge that more work in this area does also need to be carried out. So we know that women may migrate for many different reasons, to pursue opportunities in life, to study, develop careers, and to be with their families. And the remittances that they send back can provide a critical lifeline to family and friends in their countries of origin. And studies have also shown that when women recipients of remittances are responsible for household expenditures, a greater proportion is likely to be spent on their children's education, their medical bills, utilities, productive investments, as well as starting or improving a business. So really understanding the realities of migrant women's remittance sending and receiving patterns is critical to gathering this information. Before I go further into the presentation, I want to stress that while I will be focusing today on monetary remittances, I think it's important that we also recognize social remittances. And these are often transferred when people migrate across countries or regions. And they refer specifically to the export of ideas and behavior from a migration destination to the community of origin. And over time, these social remittances can be a powerful driver of change, helping to shift prevailing social norms. And that includes unsettling traditional gender roles. And that is, of course, critical to, it sort of underpins much of the discussions we're having today. But again, I'll be focusing specifically on financial remittances. Next slide, please. So one of the main sources of data on remittances is based on national balance of payments data. But more often than not, this data is not disaggregated by sex and does not capture remittances that are sent through unofficial channels. So those which are outside of banks, post offices, and commercial money transfer operators. This data that's collected also misses out on internal or domestic remittances, which remain a crucial source of income in many countries, particularly those with high rates of internal migration, and that's especially rural to urban, and those involved in cross-border trade. And without this data, the remittance sending habits of migrant women are not being accurately captured, and this in turn can have a profound effect on the development of effective gender responsive policies. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share some analysis that UN Women carried out a couple of years ago in an effort to start getting a more nuanced picture on the experiences of migrant women's remittance sending and receiving patterns. Because for a long time, we were lacking this information. We broadly had data which captured that migrant women represented around half of all global remittance senders, but we really didn't know a lot more than that. So in an effort to address these concerns and start getting a better picture of the remittance sending habits of women, UN Women worked with an expert to conduct an analysis on a limited sample of national household surveys. This was carried out from 11 countries where the sex of the remittance sender was included as a variable. So although this paper was published a couple of years ago, we do believe that it remains a valuable complement to other resources and help further discussions on gender remittances. And in particular, it links very neatly to the research that UNCDF has recently been carried out. And from this analysis, we learned that, unsurprisingly, there's no clear-cut pattern between women and men in their methods they use to remit. It depended on the country and the region. For domestic transfers, however, we did find that a larger portion of women carry home remittances themselves or via a relative, rather than using other services. The next slide, please. The one finding that is crucial to today's discussion and mirrors some of the findings in the recent UNCDF paper is that women rely more on in-person cash transfers than men. And this is important to be aware of, especially given the persistent gender pay gap, which means that not only are women earning less than men on average, but when they send remittances using these services, which, as I mentioned, they often do more frequently than men, they can end up incurring higher costs. And of course, higher cost means less money that is going into the pockets of their family or their loved ones to whom they're sending this money back home. But by improving data collection on remittance sending behavior, we're able to then use this evidence to advocate for better policies and improved access to information. And in particular, we want to look at developing stronger gender responsive policies, particularly in the area of financial inclusion. So before I go on to discuss some of the benefits of improved data in relation to migrant women and remittances, I'd briefly like to turn to some of the challenges with improving migration data from a gender perspective. So next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is looking at why we need to improve data collection, and specifically data collection from a gender perspective. So firstly, turning to the availability of data. So there is a lack of evidence on women's experiences at all stages of migration. And this is especially the case for migrant women in an irregular situation and those working in the informal economy. And there are severe gaps in the guidance for using instruments to collect and analyze sex disaggregated data and gender statistics in the context of migration. And here I'd like to take the opportunity to highlight some of the distinctions between sex disaggregated data and gender statistics. So producing gender statistics entails disaggregating data by sex or gender and other characteristics to reveal those differences or inequalities and collecting data on specific issues that affect one gender more than the other. Importantly, gender statistics should adequately reflect differences and inequalities in the situation of women and men, as well as those who identify outside of the gender binary. Sex-disaggregated data, meanwhile, is data that is disaggregated by the sex of the individual, so male or female usually, but of course, we would prefer to advance these discussions and focusing more broadly on gender to sort of push those boundaries beyond, as I said, the gender binary. So the second focus is on gender process. So gathering data using specifically designed surveys on the situations of migrant women helps in the development of evidence-based gender-responsive policies by making the realities and experiences of migrant women visible and known. And this is particularly important in today's discussion as we're looking at their remittance sending and receiving behaviors. And thirdly, related to specific challenges. So I'd like to just highlight in the context of migration data, and whilst not aligned exactly with our discussions around remittances, it's important to underscore that when thinking about women in migration, that gender-based violence, trafficking in persons, migrant smuggling, as well as limited access to decent work, social protection, limited access to services and information about safe and regular migration are all critical things to take into consideration when thinking about some challenges around data collection. But with a full understanding of these challenges, it is possible to inform national policy making to help induce legislative policy and behavioral changes that allow women to migrate, and for us also to get a much clearer idea of what these realities are. Next slide, please. So I'd briefly like to just highlight some of the sticking points. I'm not going to discuss all of them, but would just like to draw attention to a few of these. So these sticking points are in relation to the challenges in data collection. So I've identified them there as sort of the barriers that are faced at the national level. Firstly, we find that in the context of migration, that the collection of sex-disaggregated data and gender statistics in the context of migration is not always a priority for governments. And in particular, there are not always the allocated resources necessary to collect and analyze this data effectively. And if we look at number 4 as well, one of the key challenges that we've seen at the national level is that many governments also lack a capacity on the production of sex-disaggregated data and gender statistics. And this is aggravated by general obstacles, which I've identified in number 5 there, such as the lack of adequate statistical systems and infrastructure, a lack of standardization of data, and a lack of access to data among different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So importantly, for our discussion today, we need to understand why data is so crucial, and in particular, why we need to collect stronger sex-disaggregated data and gender statistics. So for migrant women, particularly those with an irregular migration status, they often face significant barriers in accessing formal banking and financial services and technologies. And some of these barriers include proof of residency or documentation requirements. And it is critical that women have access to bank accounts and financial services that are tailored to their specific needs. And this was discussed by Aloma in the beginning. This is something this is where data can really come in. A gender-responsive approach to remittances would consider the barriers to migrant women's financial inclusion and their lack of access to formal remittance service providers, as well as modern telecommunications technology. The collection of sex-disaggregated data and gender statistics on remittances would enable governments to capture gender-specific trends and patterns and better address the barriers that migrant women face. And this would go some way to the achievement of SDG 10.C, target 10.C, to reduce to less than 3% the transaction costs of migrant remittances and eliminate remittance corridors with higher than 5% costs, as well as towards GCM, the achievement of GCM Objective 20 on the promotion of faster, safer, and cheaper transfer of remittances and fostering the financial inclusion of migrants. Here, I'd briefly like to share an example from Tanzania that we pulled out in the paper that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. That in Tanzania, the central bank introduced new regulations to increase financial inclusion by making services accessible and affordable for both domestic and international remittances. We noted in this paper that this was the only country in the study in which women, more women than men, used mobile money transfer services. So I think this shines a light on a tangible example of what happens when those changes are made. The substantive changes that allow for increasing women's financial inclusion, that can have an impact on their remittance sending behavior. Next slide, please. Oh, you're already on it. Sorry, you were there. It was on recommendation. Thank you, you got ahead of me. So I just want to highlight here some of the recommendations that came out of this paper that I think are important to note, and a good complement to the recommendations that Uloma mentioned in her opening presentation. So it's important that we encourage national statistics offices and others responsible for household surveys to include questions on the sex or gender, as well as the occupation of remittance senders. We want to promote the collection of disaggregated data on remittances, particularly for balance of payment purposes. We want to use disaggregated data to be used as a tool for strengthening relevant national policies to enhance women's financial inclusion, similarly to the example that I just shared from Tanzania, as well as work to improve migrant women's digital and financial literacy to increase their remittance sending options. Finally, I'd like to share a brief example from Niger. So next slide, please. So this example from Niger comes from UN Women's Making Migration Safe for Women program. The first phase of the program was carried out at the global policy level as well as in Niger. And that part of that program included conducting a survey on the situation of migrant women. So UN Women collaborated with the National Institute of Statistics in Niger to conduct a study on the situation of women migrating from, to, and through Niger, as well as those returning to the country, in order to address the lack of data in the context of migration in the country. So as part of this survey, 1,200 women were interviewed in 3 regions to collect qualitative information on their experiences at all stages of migration. And the data that was collected from these surveys is being used to design more effective human rights-based and gender-responsive migration programs and help inform policymaking. And it serves as an evidence base to design gender-responsive policies that can serve as an example for future studies. And in particular, we think that the way in which the survey was carried out could be used to strengthen data collection in relation to remittance patterns and behaviors of migrant women. So really serving to strengthen the evidence there that is available to then serve countries in strengthening their policies in relation to remittances and migration. And then the final slide is just a showcasing there the policy brief that came out of the research that was done a couple of years ago. And I'd like to share that that is available on UN Women's website if you'd like to take a look. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. I think you said something which really stood out to me, that improving data collection is key to making visible the invisible. And I think, there's this understanding now that migration and remittances patterns are gendered, but I think without having the access to that timely data, it's almost impossible to make relevant and timely decisions that take that data into account and can help improve financial inclusion for migrant women. So thank you for that presentation. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't already come across this UN Women study, to check it out. I think we did so at UNCDF as well as we were embarking on the demand side research project. And it did give us a lot of insights that also formed the foundation for our study. So thank you again for that. Before we move on to the next speaker, Miriam, I would like to encourage the audience, if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A section, and the panelists will address those in real time. Or during the Q&A session, so you don't have to wait till the Q&A session to ask your questions. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to Miriam.
Thanks very much, Uloma, for the lovely introduction, and also the very nice context setting that you did at the very beginning. My name is Mariam from the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, or AFI. I'm here to provide you with the policy and regulatory perspective with regard to improving financial inclusion outcomes for refugee women specifically through using data. So I'll highlight our experiences in Jordan, Rwanda, and Eswatini. Next slide, please. But before we get into the interesting bits of the presentation, I'll start us off by explaining who AFI is and why we address refugee women's financial inclusion. And then I'll touch on the role of the financial policymaker and regulator in all of this. And then I'll share the current state of affairs of financial inclusion data on refugee women. I know we're looking at remittances more specifically in this webinar, but because we represent financial policymakers and regulators, we do look at things more holistically, and remittances does come under the bigger financial inclusion agenda for us. And then I'll spotlight our work with the National Bank of Rwanda and their financial inclusion diagnostic study on refugees and host communities. And then we'll get into some learnings and reflections, and I'll finish up with sharing the opportunities and priorities for the future for AFI. Next slide, please. So what is the AFI Global Network? Next slide, please. We are a network whose membership comprises of more than 80 financial policymakers and regulators, meaning central banks and ministries of finance, from more than 82 emerging and developing countries. And we all work together to advance financial inclusion. And this is being done in parallel with the core mandate of central banks and ministries of finance, which is to maintain financial stability, integrity, and consumer protection. So we're doing all this, we're taking forward that mandate of the central bank and Ministry of Finance together with advancing sustainable development as well. So I said emerging and developing countries because we do represent the global south, and we currently represent 85% of the global unbanked population. Our goal is to support our members in developing and implementing financial inclusion policies that address their specific country challenges. So this includes forced displacement or high rates of financial inclusion of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. We are essentially governed and owned by our members. So they're our bosses, and we collaborate with our members on equal footing, and most of the time we are relying heavily on their expertise. Next slide, please. So what is the role of the financial policymaker and regulator in all of this? Okay, thank you. I think Michael also kind of alluded to it. And actually in the beginning, when we started the FGP financial inclusion work stream at AFI about 7 years ago, this was really not clear at all. At that time, only a couple of our members had the clarity of what their role was in advancing financial inclusion using remittances, including using remittances remittances for refugees and refugee women. But this has changed now. Now we know that the financial policymaker and regulator has a very prominent and a role to play in collecting sex and age disaggregated data on refugees, financial inclusion data on refugees, and then using that data to inform policy. So to integrate refugees and refugee women into national policies initiatives. One that we like to recommend that they are integrated in our national financial inclusion strategies. This is because we find national financial inclusion strategies to be a very powerful policy tool to ensure that all financial inclusion efforts are coherent and harmonized. How it looks like usually is there's a common vision for what financial inclusion for achieving financial inclusion in 3 years or 5 years, and then the different stakeholders actually design that together and then implement that together later on. The financial policymaker and regulator also has a role to play in simplifying customer due diligence and know your customer requirements to facilitate the onboarding of refugees who might not have the identification documents to access formal financial services, including remittances, of course. And then also regulators and policymakers have a role to play in facilitating multi-stakeholder coordination. So I'll keep reiterating this throughout my presentation, but we think it's so important to do this from the very beginning of the policy cycle in order to raise awareness, build trust, and also find and implement policy solutions together. Finally, we also think that the policymaker and regulator has an important role to play in improving the perception that RSP, remittance service providers and other financial service providers, their perception of refugee women. Next slide, please. So what does that all mean in practical terms? I'd just like to show you what the Central Bank of Jordan did. So refugees were identified as a priority segment alongside 3 other target groups, which were the bottom 40% women and youth. So this is their national financial inclusion strategy pillars. And so Central Bank of Jordan is actually the one and only central bank in the whole world right now who has explicit targets for refugee financial inclusion in their national financial inclusion strategy. But we hope to change this as the years go on, and I'll show you how. So they explicitly established targets here, and this helped to destigmatize refugees as a target population, and it also incentivized financial service providers and other implementers of the national financial inclusion strategy to also advance financial inclusion for refugees. And then they made it acceptable for refugees to use their UNHCR ID to open mobile money accounts, and they provided regulatory clarity to financial service providers, including remittance service providers, on that simplified KYC and CDD framework. Because while it's important, sometimes you have an enabling policy and regulatory environment, if there is no regulatory clarity, it's very rare that the financial service provider will actually use the flexibilities in the regulatory framework. They also established a coordination structure that enabled multi-stakeholder coordination and collaboration around advancing refugee financial inclusion, and it's called the DFS, or Digital Financial Services Council, and the membership is composed of regulators, banks, remittance service providers, PSPs, UN organizations, and so on. Next slide, please. And the National Financial Inclusion Strategy was informed by a National Financial Inclusion Diagnostic Study. So at AFI, so we have 80 members, 60 members have National Financial Inclusion Strategies, and they are all informed by National Financial Inclusion Diagnostic Studies. Diagnostic studies usually comprise of a demand side survey, so household level, a supply side survey, so also finding out what the financial service providers are doing, and then a policy and regulatory review. So that's what we do in the financial inclusion community. The CBJ, they conducted a national financial inclusion diagnostic study and covered the refugee population in that. They asked the same questions to refugees and non-refugees, but they also disaggregated the data collection by sex, age, and geographical area. And that helped them to set a baseline on the level of refugee financial inclusion and then explicit targets that they could all work towards when implementing the strategy. Next slide, please. So the state of affairs on financial inclusion data on refugee women. Next slide, please. So I think Michael also already alluded to this. It barely exists. Sorry to disappoint, but unfortunately, it really barely exists, and they are an invisible economy. 33 of our member jurisdictions have a sizable population of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons, but currently only 5 collect sex and age financial inclusion data on refugees. So indeed, they are an invisible economy to financial policymakers and regulators, and little is known about their specific financial needs, the barriers that they face, and how financial services can actually augment their financial health beyond financially including them. So they are doubly disadvantaged. Next slide, please. Okay, on this slide, I just wanted to differentiate, according to us, like sex, between sex and gender disaggregated data. So for us, sex disaggregated data breaks down information according to person's sex or biological info. But then gender disaggregated data will look at the more nuanced things like sociocultural norms, and religion and things like this. So in reality, it's much more easy to collect sex disaggregated data than gender disaggregated data. For us, sex disaggregated data can be collected via quantitative surveys or supply side data surveys, but gender disaggregated data will involve focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and in-depth interviews in a safe space for such a vulnerable segment of women. Next slide, please. Okay, so because I'm talking so much about the broader financial inclusion policy area, I just wanted to show you this data point. We also conducted a diagnostic study with the Ministry of Finance of the Kingdom of Eswatini on refugee financial inclusion, and we did find that remittances play a huge role in financial including refugees in the kingdom. Based on the diagnostic study, we developed a roadmap to the financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons, which is a policy change, essentially. And we provided recommendations such as expanding access to mobile money services so that they can use remittances better and then deepen their financial inclusion in consequence. And then we also found out that a majority of refugees actually rely on remittances as a source of income. So one of the recommendations in the roadmap is to expand financial literacy and digital financial literacy for the population. We also use the diagnostic study to inform a national financial education strategy that was just published by the ministry as well. And we managed to use that data to provide recommendations on refugees. Next slide, please. And then this one was to show you that refugees use mobile money for remittances compared to banks, but mostly because it's more easy. It's easier to onboard them and provide them with mobile money accounts rather than bank accounts just because of the KYC and CDD requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so this was just to give you a taste of what a demand side survey questionnaire actually looks like and how we disaggregate the data by sex and age and so on. So this is what just wanted to show you that just to demystify things. So you can see sex of household head, we asked male, female, and respondent gender as well, but it's also still limited to males and females right now. Next slide, please. Yeah, so then we use the questionnaire to look at the financial inclusion barriers, financial inclusion opportunities, the types of products that refugees use or don't use, and so on. So we already do this in all of our member jurisdictions, but we're starting to do this for the refugee populations in our member jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Okay, just to spotlight the National Bank of Rwanda's work on this real quickly. let's skip this slide and go to the next one because we're short on time. Okay, so the reason the National Bank of Rwanda wanted to undertake a financial inclusion diagnostic study on refugees was because the National Financial Inclusion Strategy was silent on the issue of refugees, even though they have such a huge population of them. The methodology involved using multi-stakeholder workshops. So I think, Michael, you also highlighted that awareness levels are a barrier, low awareness levels are a barrier. We also find coordination is a barrier, lack of coordination is a barrier when it comes to implementing policy change for refugee financial inclusion. So we use national multi-stakeholder workshops to raise awareness, create traction, but also build trust. But this was also where we started to scope the lack of financial inclusion data on refugees and refugee women. When we had the first workshop, we were like, oh no, we are really in trouble, because yes, the UNHCR or the humanitarian stakeholders, they do have data on refugee women, but not financial inclusion data specifically at all. So it scared us a little bit, but then we conducted a demand side survey. We did a policy and regulatory review. But then at that time, we also did not leverage supply side data because they did not, the FSPs did not collect data on refugees at that time. So we're trying to change that. The demand side survey involved quantitative survey and then also in-depth interviews to look at those gender nuances when it comes to refugee women's financial inclusion. We surveyed both refugees and host communities, and 48% of the respondent sample was female, 59% under 30 years. Next slide, please. And this is how we disaggregated the in-depth interviews. So we tried to interview as many women as we did men. There were some reservations with Somalian refugees because they were not comfortable doing the interviews, but we tried our best. We also interviewed refugees living with disabilities and the youth. Next slide, please. And we found out that actually refugee women were less financially included, and also and this also was for formal inclusion and informal inclusion. So this is what the data looks like when we collect it. Next slide, please. And then even for mobile money accounts versus bank accounts, women were less included than men, unfortunately. Next slide, please. And how we transform that data into policy. We provided policy recommendations to the central bank and their stakeholders, and we would provide a policy recommendation that looks a bit like this. So you involve female agents, female employees, and women-owned small enterprises in various financial inclusion programs. One thing we also found out from the IDIs was that some refugees did face harassment and things like that in the camp that prevented them from actively seeking formal inclusion. Next slide, please. Okay, just some learnings and reflections. So sex and age disaggregated financial inclusion data on refugees still very, very, very limited. Like I said, only 5 are collecting now, and even that we're in the midst of collecting that type of data. In Rwanda, though, because we did that first diagnostic study, refugees will be included in their next FinScope, which is the financial inclusion data collection exercise in the African region. And the rest are quite straightforward. I just wanted to highlight that multi-stakeholder workshops are very important and useful to ensure that mutual understanding and also enhance the collaboration between different stakeholders. I know there are UN agencies and humanitarian and development organizations here. The financial policy and policymaker and regulator cannot do things without you. So it's very important that you reach out to them and also share with them your expertise and what you know about this vulnerable segment. Next slide, please. Okay, and one thing I wanted to highlight from the learnings is that without foundational legal rights, it's almost impossible that their financial inclusion can lead to anything meaningful. So you can financially include women, but if refugee women, but if they don't have access to decent employment, access to free movement, access to collateral and things like this, their financial inclusion cannot lead to their financial health. So it's very important, again, that multi-stakeholder collaboration to have the financial policymaker and regulator work very closely with the line ministries, ministry dealing with refugees and migrants, ministries working with women, and also all the other stakeholders to ensure that those rights are there and that they can really enhance their livelihoods and economic empowerment. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to show you our policy framework for the financial inclusion of FDPs. You can find this online, but I wanted to highlight that one of the Pillar 1 is actually the first step in the policy cycle when it comes to financially including refugees and other FDPs. And we highlight data collection and multi-stakeholder coordination very much. In there, we provide much more guidance on how you can do this better. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. So just to conclude, moving forward, we'd like to promote this even more, to enhance our interventions for doubly disadvantaged groups with a special focus on refugee women, but also to work more closely with other stakeholders. We've heard from UN Women now, and I can't wait to hear from Remitly how we can work more closely together to make refugee and migrant women's financial inclusion a reality. Next slide, please. And again, like I said, coordination. So thank you so much. Sorry that took a bit longer, but I'll address the questions later. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you, Miriam, for that presentation. And it was great to hear from, the view of the regulators and how they view what they view as their role in advancing the financial inclusion for women. Maybe a bit interesting to hear that not that many central banks as yet are including refugees as a target population for consideration as they're developing their national financial inclusion strategies. But it's great to see that indeed AFI is continuing to work on this process and ensure that the central banks and ministries of finance are brought along through the process. And I think you touched on something important, that it's going to take a multi-stakeholder approach, so beyond the central banks and the ministries of finance. But if refugees and migrants do not have legal status that allows them to even access financial services, then it's impossible to talk about the work of improving their financial inclusion. So I think with that, we'll hand over the floor to Daniel from Remitly.
All right, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Daniel Escher. I lead customer research for Remitly. Next slide, please. Just because I always like to start with where am I coming from in the world? So my pronouns are he, him, or L for Spanish speakers on the call. I live in Seattle, Washington. That's where I did my undergraduate degree in international studies in Spanish. My PhD is in sociology from University of Notre Dame. And I'll fast forward several intervening years there. And now I lead product and market research at Remitly. This is a photo from conducting research last summer with one of my colleagues in the background, where we were very intentional in developing a new financial product to include a wide range of genders and participants in that. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Remitly. We have been in business for over a decade at this point. So we were founded in 2011. Right now, we have about 4,800 corridors. So these are pairs of send and receive countries. So corridor, send and receive country. And that involves over 170 different countries around the world. We have 15 languages available in our app. And I point that out for a couple of reasons. One is that we do tend to see different levels of education by gender. And we also see different levels of acculturation by gender. And so we we want to make our product as accessible as possible, so that, let's say, if you're living in the United States, you have a wide range of options to use our product. If you're living in Germany, sending money to Turkey, let's say, we don't just want to presume that you speak German. We also want to make our product available to you in Turkish. And then our disbursement network is really quite large. We're able to send to 4 billion bank accounts around the world, 1.2 billion mobile wallets, and then 460,000 cash pickup locations. And as other speakers have mentioned, financial inclusion is often a ladder. So we want to meet customers with where they are, right? So cash pickup location may be where they are now, but then as they are able to gain access to a mobile wallet or to a bank account, we certainly want to be there for them in those places as well. Next slide, please. I won't read through this slide, but gender inclusion obviously has a number of dimensions to it. And so, at Remitly, certainly on my team, certainly on many other teams across the company, we have to think of the holistic picture of our customer and the full experience that they go through, and ways that we need to be inclusive of gender in those situations, alongside other kinds of lenses like socioeconomic class, race, nationality, and so on. One thing that I'll underscore here that I'll come back to is overall brand. And let me just kind of put a pin in that, and then I'll come back to that in a little bit when I talk about marketing. Next slide, please. So data collection is a balancing act for us. We at Remitly try to be very intentional with the data we collect about our customers. So certainly, we want to verify who the customer is. We want to comply with Know Your Customer or KYC regulations, also AML or anti-money laundering regulations, any other national regulations that may exist. We also need to balance this with how our customers view all of this data, right? So many of our new customers are concerned about their data security, their data safety. They hear about hacks on a national level. They hear about data, being hacked on a personal level. And so data collection can raise suspicions and increase barriers to use. So very directly, customers have told me, have told others at the company, questions like, who's tracking this information? Will Remitly report me to the government, right? And here's a quote from a customer, Mary, who sent just once with Remitly because she felt like her privacy was invaded because we were asking too many personal questions about her. And so it's a real balancing act. This desire to formalize remittances, but also do so in a way that keeps customers included, and not re-informalizing them, so to speak. Next slide, please. All right, so how do we promote gender inclusion at Remitly while balancing these privacy and data concerns? I'll share a couple of examples. We, of course, rely heavily on internal research and then external data when available. So let me share an example about representation in marketing. Next slide. Thank you. So this example is about the imagery that we use in our marketing. And for this example, we drew from a number of sources. One was customer surveys, and so that's our own customer base, right? We also obviously want to keep an eye on what is happening in the broader market in a broader country. And so about every quarter or every 2 quarters, we conduct what's called an omnibus survey, where we examine the total market of remittance senders in various countries. We also use governmental surveys like in the US, let's say the American Community Survey, in Canada, data provided by StatsCan. We also use third-party surveys like what the reports that UNCDF has produced. Those are actually really valuable to us. We then try to integrate those data and then generate hypotheses for testing and market. So here's a very concrete example in the next couple of slides. So if you took a time machine back to 2018, so 5 years ago, and looked at the ads that we were running for North America to India money sending, so US to India, Canada to India, you would have seen a lot of ads that looked like this. So ads that strongly emphasized essentially men and sports. And certainly, cricket has very wide appeal. And so I want to be cognizant of that, especially knowing the Cricket World Cup is coming up here. But the effect of this was that we had a high proportion of our customer base that was men. Next slide, please. But if we compare that to census data from the US and from Canada, we saw that the foreign-born population of Indians was more like 50-50 to women to men. We also saw from our omnibus survey that we conducted of the total market that the remittance sending population was about 55% men, 45% women. And so, we obviously saw an opportunity there. And so we very intentionally have introduced imagery and different forms of advertising that include women. Not just on the sender side, but also on the receive side or on the recipient side, right? And so you can see a couple of examples of ads that we've run in the past on the left side, and then actually the photos on the right are our current landing page, we call it, or website for sending from I believe this is US to India. And so the effect of that was that we saw a 15 percentage point absolute change in our customer base. So we were able to drastically increase the number of women by improving our marketing representation. Next slide, please. So I'll share an example of product development now, and then I'll wrap. Let's see, so next slide. Okay. Oh, excuse me, one slide back. Thank you. So I'll call this product feature Be There, and apologies for being a little cryptic or mysterious about this product, but it's still kind of behind a curtain, so to speak. And so I want to talk about some of the ways that we have thought about gender throughout the product's development, alongside a couple of additional lenses. Obviously, we think about intersectionality. So one of those is socioeconomic in terms of education and income, especially, and then a cultural lens, especially thinking of wider social norms, perceptions, and know-how for our customers. Next slide. All right, so what you'll see in the purple boxes here is your classic life cycle for the development of a product. So of course, we want to identify the customer problem, size the opportunity, understand who we are building the product for, explore potential solutions, test those solutions before launch, and then launch, learn, and iterate as a result. And usually the cycle repeats. And so let me share just a little bit about some of the ways that we made sure to be gender inclusive in this development. So one is that, over the years, my team and I have listened very carefully to a wide range of customers about their remitting experience and about their receive experience increasingly too, right? And so we identified a set of problems that we were seeing there. We then sized the particular customer problem, and in one of the surveys that we ran, we found that women immigrants were about 15% more likely, in absolute terms, to be in a certain kind of situation. Again, apologies for being a little cryptic about what that situation is. So we then created personas, and we chose a persona who was a woman, who was lower income, and intentionally did not create this product feature for financial optimizers who were likelier to be men and higher income. We then conducted in-person interviews, especially relying heavily on a woman already in a particular community who is already trusted. And we made sure to evenly balance participation in terms of gender and also in terms of socioeconomic status. And then as we've been testing pre-launch, we've been really careful about who we include in that testing. And in particular, I'll call out the importance of paying attention to body language, not just what customers or potential customers say, but really how are they responding to the product physically, right? Like that can actually be far more informative than the words they are saying because of various social norms, social desirability bias, and things like that. All right, so with that, I will actually wrap there. And I thank you so much for your time and this opportunity.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it was interesting to see how Remitly is considering the dimensions of gender inclusion at various levels, including policy and regulation, all the way down to products, and even going as far as looking at gender inclusion in pricing and the overall brand of the company. So with that, in the interest of time, we're going to move into the Q&A portion, and we'll have one question per speaker. Thank you to everyone who's put their questions in the chat. I see that the panelists have already addressed a lot of those questions. And maybe we'll start with Robin, since we haven't gotten to hear from him yet. Robin, there was a question in the chat about the difference between sex and gender disaggregated data. And if you could start there, I think that would segue nicely into the question that I have for you.
Oh, thanks. And it's a good question. I'm a little bit under the weather, which is why I haven't been speaking much at this webinar. But basically, I mean, sex disaggregated data, consider that analyzing, often the problem is we analyze the average man versus the average woman. And neither the average man or the average woman exist or is really relevant for policy or product improvements. And so sex disaggregated is really, are you born a man, woman, and analyze, and there are gaps there, right? So there's a global pay gap of 10 to 15%, with women earning less for similar jobs as men do. There's gaps in informal employment, for example. When we look at financial inclusion on the access front, there's also a little bit of a gap at 6% globally. But for example, even in remittances, our study has now found that while if you look at digital remittances, and we looked at the providers, the 10 remittance service companies, that there's still a real access gap, that in most of the markets that we work, 3 out of 10 women are on the digital apps, compared to 5 or 6 out of 10 doing cash-based remittances or agent-based remittances, or let's say in the whole market. So there's severe gaps there. When we go into gender disaggregated data analytics, that's far broader. Then you also have to look at household dynamics. who's controlling the remittances. And one of the findings that we've seen on that from our surveys is, for example, that men more often have control over remittances than women. And 1 out of 10 remittances that we've done in our survey, we found that the woman was not in control of how the remittances could be spent. It was mainly the husband. So there's gaps there as well, and that goes more into gender disaggregated analytics. Another major one, I think, is education. I think if you look globally at digital remittances markets, a lot of them are able to reach people with tertiary or university degrees. Let's say if you look at education, but it's far, far harder to reach people with primary low income. And that requires, and I think that's another major finding also from my study, that requires really financial literacy, intervention and support. So you need both. You need sex disaggregated data analytics, gender disaggregated data analytics. They're fluid. I mean, they'll help to improve the products and services, but foremost to address some of those gender gaps. Again, sex being more biological, gender being more sociological concepts in that. So.
Great, thank you, Robin, for that clear definition of the difference between sex and gender disaggregated data. And so maybe with that, we'll segue into the next question that I have for both you, Robin, and for Michael. Looking at the data that both UNCDF and UN Women have collected over the last couple of years, what key themes do you expect will emerge and inform remittance policy development in the near future? And maybe you can limit that to two of the most important themes you see emerging.
Maybe Michael, I'll go first, and then but I think both UNCDF and UN Women known as a little bit, of course, it should not be ignored. That's number one. If we hear that sort of few central banks are collecting this data, but then at the same time we hear a great player like Remitly doing all this work on gender, there's a real need for this, at least that we've seen from private sector, to look into this. So I think more and more that we'll mainstream this, right? It will go to a situation where this becomes a must, because it's such a substantive gap, because especially when you look at low income people, less educated people, these gender gaps will amplify, right? And also because this digitization is going, of course, very, very fast. With COVID, it has gone at an exponential pace. We have one partner which started out with 1 out of 3 transactions being digital, and now 95% of them are digital. So it's going to be absolutely of importance. I don't think it's going to be this sort of nice to do thing anymore 5 years from now. That's my hope, at least. And Michael, I'll gladly pass the ball to you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Loma, for the question. And I'll keep it brief, as I know we've hit time. But I think one of the key themes that has come out is the importance of really sort of centering a human rights-based approach. As Robin just touched on, the private sector is leading on this. It's very sort of customer-driven. But what we really need to see is we need to switch that lens and recognize that this is a human rights issue more than anything. There's huge value in the importance of, as Aloma, you sort of highlighted, sort of making the invisible visible. We really need to recognize that in this context, migrant women are making huge contributions, not only to their families and their communities, but also to sustainable development more broadly, both through financial remittances as well as social remittances. And I think just switching the lens through which we're addressing the issue of remittances, and I thank again UNCDF for really centering these discussions with this report. And I think we're seeing those themes, and I think we're able to sort of collectively see the sort of the importance of driving these conversations forward in the hope of ensuring that we can improve women's financial inclusion and ensure that they are not, as the UN often speaks of, being left behind, and particularly as Robin alluded to, the pace at which digitization is happening, we can't have half the world's population in so many countries just not able to even access those services. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Robin. Miriam, the next question is directed at you, and looking at the work that AFI is doing, you talked about the example of the Central Bank of Jordan being the only one that, to date has included refugees as a target segment on their national financial inclusion strategy. So what are some practical ways that organizations already working with sex disaggregated data and using that to shape gender smart policy can work together better to build more momentum in data collection, analysis, and use? And maybe if you could, limit that to one or two practical ways, including what AFI is working on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So one practical way we're doing that is to promote collaboration at the country level between the central bank or Ministry of Finance with other authorities like line ministries and also humanitarian and development partners, so that they can work together and collect this sex and age disaggregated financial inclusion data on refugee women and other migrant women. Yes, Central Bank of Jordan was the only one, but currently the other four are also working towards that. So it's very important that we share that knowledge and we try to implement that at the country level. Second is also to encourage financial policymakers and regulators to reach out to humanitarian partners and development partners so that we understand those human rights issues that Robin and Michael highlighted, because we don't really have, that's not where our expertise is. We're financial inclusion experts, but we don't really have that human rights angle all the time quite perfectly. So it's again coming down to coordination at the national level, but also peer learning at regional and global levels as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Miriam. And with that, Daniel brings me to the last question. You talked about, data collection being a balancing act, and I really like how you illuminated or walked us through that process. So my question is, how can we ensure that policymakers have quick and reliable access to the sort of sex disaggregated data that remittance service providers such as Remitly are generating in any one country, region, or corridor?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It is a balancing act, right? We want to keep our customers, right? We want to make them feel comfortable. We want them to feel safe and that they can trust us. We also recognize that there's a large opportunity, right? And that and that the availability of data can drive so many different decisions. And so we want to figure out, ways that we can share data in an anonymized manner and support this work while also balancing, the needs and interests of promoting strong consumer data privacy and security standards.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all of the panelists. So I think that brings us to the end of the discussion. Thank you to everyone on the call who stuck with us. And I think just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight three key things that stood out to me. I think one is the idea that data is crucial to making visible those that can otherwise be economically invisible, and that it requires a multi-stakeholder approach, I think, which Miriam alluded to. So it's not just the multilaterals like UNCDF or UN Women working on this topic, but it also involves the financial regulators on one end, also involves the private sector companies like Remitly on the other end, also bearing in mind keeping the migrants and the refugees at the center of the decision-making process. And we talked a lot about the barriers, but it also is encouraging to see that there are several strategies being applied on different fronts to overcome these challenges. So I think with that, we'll move to close today's discussion. Thank you to our panelists for those great presentations. The presentations and the recording will be made available to everyone who joined the call today. And so I think with that, we'll move to close today's session. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.